Welcome back to another episode of Aboutcast. It is your main man holding it down while Julian is away, Jordan. And before we start this episode, I just wanted to say I really hope that everyone's doing well during this time and all your loved ones are in good health, whether that be financially, mentally, physically, of course, and keep fighting a good fight. And without further ado, well, I guess one more thing. I really appreciate doing this. Doing this for over 2 years now. It feels like kind of a part of me. And it feels really natural to, record and talk to you guys. And of course, sometimes maybe you guys feel like I'm talking at you, but it's definitely dialogue. And I really appreciate the input, questions, everything, every interaction. Really appreciate it. So thank you for listening to this. I definitely really appreciate it for sure. So getting into this or today's podcast, as you know, if you listened to the last podcast 2 weeks ago, we're going to be talking about a interesting pair of people in history that have no connection that I've ever seen before in writing. So once again, if you've listened to that, you're going to hear this again. This might be somewhat of a reach, but I found it extraordinarily intriguing to talk about these two really prolific figures in their own rights. And I'll keep this short, being that I've already said this stuff, but the two people I'm talking about are Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician in the 1600s, and then I'm also talking about Pete Maravich, who was an NBA Hall of Fame basketball player and was prolific in his own sense in sports. So I did cover Pistol Pete in the last episode, so this will be more about Blaise Pascal, but definitely anticipate having the interplay of kind of overlapping life experiences in between there. And specifically, the reason that I started this series was to talk about a really peculiar starting of their childhood, being that they were both precocious, but at the same time, they had this specific experience where they were held back from the thing that they were most prolific at to start their life. And then once that train got rolling, there was no stopping them. So let's get into it. So Blaise Pascal was, of course, the French mathematician, and he was born in France in 1623, June 19th. And throughout his life, he was 39 when he passed away. But the thing that I think is, important to take away, he grew up with a few sisters, and his mom died at the age of 3, so quite young. And what that gave is a peculiar or precarious situation with his father, where his father was quite intelligent, not, let's say, among the aristocracy of the time in France, but very well educated and respected as a tax collector of sorts. Or not a tax collector, but dealt with tax and was a judge of tax court specifically. And the experience that Blaise Pascal had that I think was one of the ones that shaped him was being after his mother died, the father, which I've been avoiding saying because, I'm definitely going to butcher this, but I think his name is Etienne Pascal. He essentially decided to homeschool his son, and that's where I think all of this stuff happened. So the main thing that they focused on, just to start with, and Blaise was, naturally like quite an intelligent young child, and I think that was picked up on by his father, and that's why he decided to homeschool him, so that he could get a proper education where they could go as fast as Pascal or Blaise wanted to. And so the first thing that they started focusing on was language. And that includes like the Latin language, And so Pascal became like quite educated and a polyglot in a really, really short amount of time. But the thing that was the really interesting piece that kind of links them together and what I originally found was that Blaise Pascal was stopped from learning math and actually forbade from learning math when he was growing up as a kid. And the first thing was, like I said, was the actual language. So once Blaise Pascal kind of got that forbidden fruit of math, the kid never stopped. So, at a very, very young age, as you guys could imagine, Blaise Pascal was doing, extraordinary things with mathematics as far as when he was quite young and when he was about 13 in 1640, he wrote an essay on the conic sections, or a total essay about kind of synthetic projective geometry. And he also created a calculator, being that his dad was a tax judge. He essentially created one of the first digital calculators ever produced, and it operated by counting integers. And that was in 1644. So when he was 17, he did something that nobody else could do to help his dad out with the work. And once again, Blaise Pascal was extraordinarily prolific and very dominant in the ranks of his field, and he touched a lot of things. He grew up religious, and they were strictly Roman Catholic when growing up, so Roman Catholic principles. So theology. He also was amazing in philosophy, which we'll touch on some of his axioms, or not axioms, but the popular things of his works and outputs. So we'll talk about the Pascal's wager, which I'm sure you've heard of if you're stopping on this podcast. But if not, we'll definitely explain it, and you'll be polished up on that one. And then obviously with mathematics and just science in general. And so these fields he touched, I think that they had, different inner workings and different flows throughout his lifetime. And I think that also mirrors Pete's as well, Pistol Pete. And that definitely comes into play more so when we're talking about kind of their choices in theology and religious prescription that we'll go through in a little bit later, because that's what happens later in Pascal's life from my research. And so essentially around, I guess maybe not too much later, but when Pascal was a young man, I think about 23, his dad fell ill. And this is one of the, I think normally in situations, people will kind of throughout hard times lean on faith, even if they weren't extraordinarily devout beforehand. But I think this is a classic example of that happening. So when his dad fell ill, Pascal definitely leaned more towards faith, and interestingly, he ran into a few disciples of a religion called, or a sect in Christianity called Jansenism. And essentially Jansenism, which I think is like really interesting, thinking of what Blaise did later with Pascal's wager, is essentially kind of it's described as a heresy in like Catholic religion, and the reason why is because one of the main things that it goes against was free will. And so it essentially says, the guy that kind of thought of it, Jansen, he had this, he made this writing, or published a thing called the Augustinacism. And essentially what it does is it talks about how it downplays free will and almost kind of totally casts it away in the actual Catholic faith. So you don't have even if you acted great, you still wouldn't be like brought to heaven. And it essentially just put all the faith on predeterminism and the divine grace. And so essentially what that was is kind of more of a kookier version, I think, at the time. It was like, almost like it didn't exist very long, or wasn't popular very long during the time. And it was kind of one thing that was happening locally between like France and a few other places in Europe. But essentially, that's kind of what Pascal took to. And, at the time, I think Blaise was still battling between kind of the aesthetic life that, Jansenism kind of prescribed to, and the worldly life. And when I say worldly life, I am kind of alluding to kind of like producing and publishing scientific journals and things of that nature, which Pascal obviously had a great passion for. And so he kind of drifted back and forth here and there. But during that time of drifting back and forth, I think actually let me go take a step back. I think one of the most interesting things about Blaise Pascal is his extraordinary pragmatism, and especially when it comes to things that might not necessarily be the most pragmatic, especially when it comes to faith. And I think we can talk about that a little bit further on when he gets quite a bit more religious. But that's one thing that I found really interesting about him. He was very grounded, and was I felt like he was like, being the father of probability, or a really, really extraordinary player in the probability and the rules and things of that we use today. I think he kind of had that mind and had that type of mechanistic thinking that kind of provided him to be quite a pragmatist in all places in life. And so going on, essentially, during that time, Pascal also created essentially a unit of pressure called pascals, which everyone's, or not everyone, sorry, but people are aware of. And it essentially kind of is a play off of the barometer, and it uses hydraulic presses to measure pressure of an area. And it's still popularly used today. And essentially, Pascal is going through his life creating, producing and publishing pieces of scientific journals and whatnot. And then here's where we interplay again with Pistol Pete. Later in his life, and later as in later in his life compared to when he died. In 1654, late in that year, in November, coming on to December, he became to get quite religious, and more so than before. And he wanted to start a new life. And throughout my research, and maybe this is kind of selective hearing, you might say, but through understanding what that turning of the page was for Pascal, kind of battling between being more devout and kind of dabbling in the scientific world still, was from what I've heard from listening to documentaries and whatnot, was actually Pascal got spoke to. And this is actually the same thing that Pistol Pete professed, or said happened to him, that made him become like quite devout. And before, Pistol Pete was not religious, not even active. I don't think active is a good word for Pistol Pete, but it's quite interesting that both later in their life, they had the same experience, or similar experience, similar to what they had in the beginning of their life, with essentially, the kind of the Machiavellian thing of holding them back from what they love. Now they're having this religious, like extraordinarily powerful religious thing that happened in the same type of way, where they heard this kind of divine voice that came out of nowhere that compelled them to be much more devout. But anyway, so further on to Blaise, essentially, soon after that, January, so about a month and a couple days afterwards, he entered Port Royal, which is the kind of one of the headquarters of Jansenism, and kind of fully went and committed himself, and never published another publish another scientific piece under his name after that. But he did work on two, main pieces of his life's work after that, which is the Les Provinciales and then also the Pensiers. And these pieces, Pensiers, he did not finish by the time that he was, he died before it was happened to be totally completed. But Les Provinciales was, and these are where I think Pascal gets into more of his, theologian, pragmatist kind of flow. And it's quite interesting to see kind of it's almost like those guys that I see Blaise Pascal as one of those dudes who are a Renaissance man, where they kind of can do it all, whether it be like, in a pop culturally prevalent way, like kind of Donald Glover, where he's Childish Gambino, a rapper. He's also, been an actor. He's also produced movies. He's done comedy, things of that nature, where, you see a guy and their just hands are in everything, and you can't put a finger on what they exactly do, because of they can do so much, and it would almost be a disservice to them. But essentially around this time of his life, he also, did Pascal's wager. So all of you holding your breath for that, you can take a big sigh of relief, because we'll talk about that a lot more. And essentially, I think before I tell you about this, I just really want to bring up the point once more, where even though, religion and theology, it was extraordinarily large and momentous at the time, it also, was studied and was a very firm standing on. It still took a bit of faith, I believe, to fully commit to religion and, be as devout as people were expected to be, or even Pascal was. But at the same time, I don't think everybody kind of looked at it with very non-tinted glasses like eyes. And so this is where I think Pascal's wager fits perfectly into Jainism, or Jansenism. Apologize. Essentially, Pascal's wager is stated as such. So, even if there is not a God, it is wise to believe in one. And so the reason is because if you cannot prove there is a God, or if there isn't one, essentially you should, be religious, because throughout your lifetime, there's a finite amount of life that you can live. But if you live it devoutly, then you can get into heaven and live forever. And so you have this finite thing that you have to compromise on, in a sense, to get this forever thing, this, infinity. And so, of course, we're talking about Blaise Pascal here, the Mac Daddy of probability. And so you can think of it as a probability. And anything that you multiply with, any non-zero number that you multiply with, or non-negative, I guess, with infinity, you get infinity still. So essentially what it is you have this finite thing on the left, which is a life of devotion, and you get this, infinite thing on the right. And, below, you can look at it as, if you weren't devout and just lived however you wanted to live, finite, but then you also live in hell, or, at the very least, you don't get into heaven. So you have this finite benefit, this infinite downside, you can say. And essentially this is where Pascal's wager sits. So there's a big flaw in Pascal's wager. For all of you who know this, and for those who are hopping on the train later, and the big finite thing that we're dealing with is the fact that there's multiple religions. So essentially what you get is, then you have to assume that you're going to be a part of the right religion. And what then you have is, if you look at it another way, you have this one infinity to many infinities type of thing. So, what's to say you should be a devout Jansenism person, or you should be Hindu, or you should be a weird sect of Buddhism or something, essentially this is where it breaks down. So when you introduce multiple religions, which of course the world has many religions, is where this thing falls apart at its hinges. And I think it's quite interesting that Pascal also, I think it's a little bit more, it's mentioned as an afterthought, but I think it's still really interesting that there is a slight omission of, living a devout life isn't as good as living a regular life. So here's where you kind of get I'm not sure if it's the pragmatism again leaking in, and for all of you guys doing the drinking game on how many times I could say that, there's another one, but there's this underlying understanding that to be extraordinarily devout, you need to give up your life in some senses, whether it be, like just chilling out on your Sunday mornings, or, having premarital sex, or, recreation over procreation. All of those things are understood to be a thing that people give up on when they actually start being extraordinarily devout, which I think is interesting as well. So those are the tenets of the problem of Pascal's, the lock of Pascal's wager, the key of Pascal's wager as well, just in case somebody tries to pull a slick one on you and gives you that wager themselves. You can pimp slap them with logic. And essentially, another thing that I find kind of interesting is that with Jansenism, Pascal must have been the ultimate, he's the ultimate pragmatist, and kind of in the way you can think of it as, life is tough. Pascal knew this. He had struggles in his life. His mother died at a young age. He fell ill to overworking at one point in his life. But he always knew that it's better to rise to the occasion than it is to kind of submit. And, you always have the opportunity to become better. And you want to choose things that, even though life is difficult, kind of in a Nietzscheism way, take the path that, gives life more meaning and makes you a better person because of it. And, I find Blaise Pascal, being not religious myself, very understandable, which is kind of unique, because I feel like sometimes it's not as easy maybe I'm not having a dialogue with Blaise, but kind of reading and understanding his life. I think that he has a really understanding, it's not just like zealot fervor in a sense. He's still quite a logical and practical guy. And I find his understanding of religion something that coincides with myself, being that, things are utilities, ideas are utilities and things, and such. And, if you treat them as that and you don't let the utility own you in a sense, and that's when, I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before, but when, people don't have ideas have people, which I think is a common one in religion. Especially with so much emotion and so many things tied to it. I don't see Pascal really going that route, and I think he's much more logical and reasonable about it. But essentially, where we're at right now is we've kind of wrapped up the two existences of these two souls who were, if I wanted to paint it poetically, inexorably bound by the circumstances of nurture, not nature. And it created a nature of something that was prolific and, lasting throughout years and decades and centuries of accomplishment and goals and forward thinking, and really propelled them to be ahead of their time in a lot of senses. And, maybe that also propelled them to have premature deaths at 40 and 39. And granted, Pascal's, the health in the 1600s weren't as good as the health in the 1900s, or nothing. Yeah, the 1900s. But it seems so interesting to find these overlaps of, you have prolific people in different arts, similar childhood experiences, similar or quite similar religious experiences, and similar times of death. even within the year of their age. And so I find podcast things like this quite interesting, and I really look forward to them. What you can expect further on is, if you were loving that Fred Hampton and Jim Jones joints, where we kind of do a leader or character breakdown, pros and cons of strengths and weaknesses. You can expect that in the coming times. Once again, would love to hear your input and understanding of these things, and also any ideas of specific leaders. Or, I think that it would be cool to also kind of start including guests again. For those OGs, you can remember the Jeb Corliss podcast that we did, and we did a couple others with guests, fashion designers, influencers, motivational speakers, things of that nature, that we had really good numbers. So thank you guys for those. And so, considering doing those again as well. But anyway, thank you again so much for coming along on this journey with us. And, I appreciate all the support, whether it be silent, whether it be loud. You're definitely on this journey with us. And I guess I'll see you next time. Peace.